The grease-scented air of the Morning Glory diner clung to Amelia Torres like a second skin. At 24, she moved with an economy of motion, born from 6 years of balancing plates, refilling coffee, and placating the grumpy denizens of Queens before the sun had a chance to properly rise. The fluorescent lights hummed a tired tune, reflecting off the cracked red vinyl of the booths and the chrome sheen of the napkin dispensers she polished with a practiced, circular motion. Her life was a loop of lukewarm coffee, the clatter of cutlery, and the phantom ache in her feet that never quite faded, not even in sleep. Tucked beneath the counter, hidden from view, was the source of a different kind of ache. A dog-eared copy of Gray's Anatomy. Sometimes, during the late-night lull, she would trace the intricate diagrams of the human circulatory system, whispering the names of arteries and veins like a forgotten prayer. It was a relic from another life, a life before her father's construction accident and the mountain of debt that had followed, a life where she was a pre-med student with a future that smelled of antiseptic and hope, not burnt bacon. The bell above the door jingled, a sharp, intrusive sound in the quiet rhythm of the late afternoon. The man who entered didn't belong. He was a creature of steel and glass skyscrapers, of tailored suits that whispered of obscene expense, not of formica tables and bottomless coffee. His hair was the color of dark sable, shot through with a surprising slash of silver at the temples that spoke of stress rather than age. He was perhaps in his late 30s, with eyes the color of a stormy sea, and they swept the diner with a look of detached, analytical assessment, as if he were evaluating a potential acquisition rather than a place to eat. He slid into a booth, the leather sighing under his weight. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't look at her. Not really. He looked through her, a common phenomenon for a waitress, but his brand of dismissal felt different. Colder. Coffee. Black, he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate with contained energy. He pulled a slim metallic phone from his jacket, and his thumbs began to move across the screen with relentless speed. Amelia poured the coffee, her movements fluid and automatic. She set the thick ceramic mug down on the table with a quiet click. He didn't acknowledge it. She stood there for a moment, an invisible purveyor of caffeine, before retreating to the counter. He was, she decided, the epitome of everything she had come to resent about the city that lay just across the bridge, the casual arrogance of wealth, the assumption that the world was merely a backdrop for their important lives. For 20 minutes he sat there, nursing the single cup of coffee, his attention locked on the glowing screen. Then his phone buzzed with an incoming call. His expression tightened. "What is it, Helen?" he snapped, his voice low but sharp. He listened for a moment, his jaw clenching. "Food poisoning? The entire catering staff for the private room at the Gilded Steer. All of them?" He swore under his breath, a crisp, vicious sound. "No. Cancelling is not an option. Thorne is flying in from London for this. It's the final negotiation. Find a solution, I don't care how. Hire temps, pull staff from the main floor. I don't—" He stopped, his gaze lifting, and for the first time, landing directly on Amelia. It was an unnerving sensation, like being suddenly illuminated by a searchlight. His stormy eyes narrowed, a flicker of calculation in their depths. He was no longer looking through her. He was assessing her. He noted the clean, pressed uniform, the efficient way she moved, the lack of wasted motion. "Hold on," he said into the phone. He looked at Amelia. "You. Waitress." Amelia felt a prickle of annoyance. "My name is Amelia." He waved a dismissive hand, as if her name were an irrelevant detail. "Can you handle a high-end service? 3 courses, wine pairings, silver service?" The question was so out of left field, so steeped in his world and alien to hers that she almost laughed. "This is a diner. We do silver-dollar pancakes, not silver service." "That's not what I asked," he said, his tone impatient. "I'm in a bind. I need a professional, competent server for a private dinner tonight. Top steakhouse in Manhattan. The pay is $500 for the evening. Cash." $500. The number hung in the air, shimmering with possibility. It was more than she made in a week of grueling 12-hour shifts. It was a significant payment towards the debt. It was a tank of gas, groceries, a brief, blessed reprieve from the constant grinding worry. "Why me?" she asked, her suspicion warring with the desperate need. "You're here," he said, as if it were the most logical reason in the world. "And you look like you know how to work without making a scene. Yes or no? I have to make a decision in the next 30 seconds. Every instinct screamed at her to say no, to recoil from his arrogance and the cold, transactional nature of the offer. But the weight of her reality pressed down. $500 was not something she could afford to dismiss out of pride. "Fine," she said, the word tasting like surrender. "I'll do it." He nodded once, a curt, satisfied gesture. He spoke back into the phone. "I've found someone. Send a car to the Morning Glory Diner in Queens in 1 hour. Her name is Amelia." He hung up without a goodbye. He stood, pulling a crisp $100 bill from a money clip and dropping it on the table. "For the coffee, and as a retainer." He walked out without a backward glance, the bell on the door chiming his departure. Amelia stared at the $100 bill lying next to the half-empty mug. She had a name. She had just told it to him. But to him, she was just a solution, a temporary fix for a problem he had paid to make disappear. She had no idea that in a few short hours, that transactional relationship would be shattered, and she would be the one holding his life and the future of his empire in her hands. The Gilded Steer was less a restaurant and more a temple to carnivorous excess and old money. The air was thick with the scent of aged beef, expensive cigar smoke, and the faint floral notes of perfume that cost more than Amelia's rent. Dark mahogany walls were adorned with oil paintings of stern-faced men, and the hushed murmur of conversation was punctuated by the clink of heavy silverware against porcelain. A severe-looking woman with a tight chignon met her at the service entrance, handed her a crisp black uniform that felt alien against her skin, and gave her a 5-minute briefing on the evening's event. The man from the diner was Julian Davenport, CEO of Davenport Industries, a sprawling conglomerate that dealt in everything from aerospace technology to private equity. The dinner was the final stage of a hostile takeover of a British tech firm. The guest of honor was Marcus Thorne, the rival CEO, and the only other diner was Arthur Pennington, Julian's longtime chief operating officer and mentor. "Mr. Davenport is a perfectionist," the woman, whose name was Helen, said, her voice clipped. "Your job is to be invisible, anticipate needs, do not speak unless spoken to. Is that clear?" "Crystal," Amelia replied, smoothing down the unfamiliar apron. When she entered the private dining room, the 3 men were already seated. Julian Davenport looked even more formidable in this setting, the power he wielded as palpable as the chill from the air conditioning. Marcus Thorne was his opposite, slick and charming, with a smile that seemed perpetually affixed to his face, but never quite reached his cold, reptilian eyes. The third man, Arthur Pennington, was in his late 60s, with a kind face and a grandfatherly air that seemed out of place in this den of sharks. He greeted Amelia with a warm, genuine smile when she poured his water, a small gesture of humanity that she found herself clinging to. The dinner began, a tense ballet of negotiation disguised as polite conversation. Amelia moved silently around the table, refilling wine glasses, clearing plates, her diner-honed efficiency serving her well. She was invisible, just as Helen had instructed. But Amelia had spent years being invisible, and in that state she had learned to see everything. She noticed the slight tremor in Arthur Pennington's hand as he reached for his wine glass. She saw the sheen of sweat on his upper lip, despite the room's cool temperature. She noted the way his face seemed unusually flushed, a deep, ruddy color that spread from his cheeks down his neck. She initially dismissed it as the effects of the rich food, the wine, or the stress of the high-stakes deal. She watched Julian, who seemed completely absorbed in his verbal sparring with Thorne. He was sharp, ruthless, dissecting Thorne's arguments with surgical precision. But Amelia saw the quick, concerned glances he shot towards Arthur when he thought no one was looking. There was a deep-seated affection there, a bond that went beyond professional respect. The main course arrived, 3 identical plates of the restaurant's signature porterhouse steak, served with creamed spinach and potatoes au gratin. As Amelia set the plate before Arthur, she noticed something odd. A faint, almost oily sheen on the spinach, and a peculiar, slightly bitter, almond-like scent she couldn't quite place. It was gone in an instant, overwhelmed by the rich aroma of the steak. She glanced at the other 2 plates. They looked and smelled perfectly normal. It was probably just a different batch of seasoning, she told herself. A trick of the light. She retreated to her station in the corner of the room, her back to the wall, watching. "So, we're in agreement," Thorne said, dabbing his lips with a napkin. "The final offer stands. You have until morning to accept." "We'll consider it," Julian said, his voice non-committal. Arthur Pennington started to speak. "Julian, I think we need to discuss the liabilities clause." He stopped, his hand flying to his chest. A look of confusion crossed his face. He blinked rapidly, his pupils, Amelia noted with a sudden, sickening lurch, contracting to tiny pinpoints. "Arthur, are you all right?" Julian asked, his attention finally snapping away from Thorne. Arthur opened his mouth to reply, but only a gurgle escaped. His body began to twitch, a series of small, uncontrollable spasms. His fork clattered onto his plate. He gasped for air, his face turning a dusky, alarming shade of purple. "He's having a heart attack," Thorne exclaimed, jumping to his feet. "Someone call 911, Julian commanded, already pulling out his phone. But Amelia wasn't moving towards the phone. She was moving towards Arthur. The world seemed to slow down, the panicked shouts fading into a dull roar. The facts clicked into place in her mind with the cold, hard certainty of a medical diagnosis. The flushing, the sweating, the constricted pupils, the muscle twitching, the sudden respiratory distress, and that smell, that bitter, almond-like smell. It wasn't a heart attack. She reached the table in 3 long strides. "Get him on the floor," she ordered, her voice cutting through the panic with an authority that surprised even herself. "Now!" Julian, startled by her tone, complied instinctively. Together they eased the convulsing man from his chair onto the plush carpet. "What are you doing?" Thorne demanded. "He needs a doctor." "I know what this is," Amelia said, her focus entirely on Arthur. She knelt beside him, tilting his head back to clear his airway. "It's not a heart attack. It's poisoning, organophosphate poisoning." The words hung in the air, charged and horrifying. Julian stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "What? How could you possibly know that?" "I was a pre-med student," she snapped, not taking her eyes off Arthur's struggling form. "The symptoms are classic. Bradycardia, meiosis, fasciculations. He's in a cholinergic crisis. He's drowning in his own secretions. We need to roll him onto his side." She didn't wait for permission. She guided Julian's hands, showing him how to move Arthur into the recovery position. A small amount of fluid trickled from the corner of the older man's mouth. "The paramedics are on their way," Julian said, his voice strained. "Tell them what I said," Amelia commanded. "Tell them to bring atropine and pralidoxim. Tell them it's suspected organophosphate exposure. It could save his life." Julian relayed the message to the 911 operator, his eyes wide as he stared at Amelia, this waitress he had hired on a whim, who was now calmly reciting advanced medical terminology and directing a life-or-death situation. Marcus Thorne stood by the wall, his face pale, his charming smile finally gone. "This is insane," he stammered. "Poison. Here." Amelia's gaze flickered to the table, to Arthur's half-eaten plate, to the spinach with its faint, oily sheen. "It was in his food," she said, her voice low and certain. "Something on his plate that wasn't on yours." The wail of sirens grew louder, a welcome scream in the suffocating silence of the room. Paramedics burst in, a whirlwind of professional urgency. But as they assessed Arthur, their lead medic looked up at Amelia in surprise. "Cholinergic crisis is right," he said. "Good call. Who are you?" "She's with me," Julian said, finding his voice. He looked at Amelia, truly looked at her for the first time since that afternoon in the diner. He saw not a waitress, not a temporary solution, but a woman of astonishing calm and competence, a woman who had just saved his oldest friend's life. And in that moment, he knew two things with absolute certainty. First, this was no accident. This was an attack. And second, the invisible woman from the Queen's diner was now at the very center of it. The next morning, the sun rose over Queen's, casting long shadows across the quiet street where the Morning Glory diner stood. Amelia was behind the counter, moving on autopilot. She hadn't slept. The events of the previous night played on a loop in her mind. The terrifying sight of Arthur collapsing, the acrid smell of the hospital, the hours of questioning by stone-faced detectives. Julian Davenport had stayed at the hospital until the doctors confirmed that Arthur was stable. They'd said that the early, accurate diagnosis had made all the difference. The atropine had been administered in the ambulance, counteracting the nerve agent before it could do irreversible damage. Before he left, Julian had pressed a card into her hand. "Don't go anywhere," he'd said. "I'll be in touch." The bell on the diner door chimed, and Amelia looked up, expecting a regular. Instead, her blood ran cold. 4 black SUVs, the kind favored by government agencies and intimidating billionaires, were parked in a neat, menacing line outside the diner. Their tinted windows reflected the mundane street scene, making it look alien and distorted. A man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit emerged from the lead vehicle and walked into the diner. He was built like a refrigerator, with a subtle earpiece curled into one ear. "Amelia Torres?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Amelia nodded, her hand tightening on the coffee pot she was holding. "I'm Mr. Davenport's head of security. He'd like a word with you. In private." He gestured towards the lead SUV. Mrs. Gable, a regular who was nursing her morning tea in a nearby booth, stared with wide, curious eyes. This was not the kind of thing that happened at the Morning Glory. Amelia's mind raced. Was she in trouble? Was she a suspect? She had just been trying to help. She wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous, familiar gesture. "I have a shift." "It's been covered," the man said, his expression unreadable. "Your boss, Martha, has been compensated for your time today, and for the rest of the week." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. With a deep breath, Amelia untied her apron, laid it on the counter, and followed the man out into the bright morning light. The interior of the SUV was a cocoon of black leather and silence. It smelled of money and power. As they pulled away from the curb, she saw her own life, the familiar diner, the cracked sidewalk, the bus stop on the corner, receding in the rearview mirror, as if it belonged to someone else. They didn't drive into Manhattan. Instead, the convoy wound its way to a quiet, tree-lined street in Brooklyn Heights, stopping before a stately brownstone. The security chief led her inside, through a minimalist foyer, and into a large study lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Julian Davenport was standing by the window, staring out at the garden. He had changed out of yesterday's suit into dark trousers and a simple grey cashmere sweater. He looked tired, the lines of stress around his eyes deeper than before. When he turned to face her, his stormy eyes were filled with a mixture of gratitude and raw concern. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Please, sit." Amelia remained standing. "Is Arthur okay?" A small, genuine smile touched Julian's lips. "He's awake. He's weak, but he's going to make a full recovery. The doctors are calling it a miracle. I'm calling it you." He paused, his gaze intense. "You saved his life, Amelia. There's no other way to put it. I owe you a debt I can never truly repay." "I just did what anyone would have done," she murmured, uncomfortable with the weight of his gratitude. "No," he said, shaking his head. "That's not true. Everyone else in that room, myself included, froze. We saw a man having a heart attack. You saw the truth. You saw the details everyone else missed." He gestured to a chair again. "Please." This time she sat. He sat in the chair opposite her, leaning forward, his hands clasped. "I had my team look into you this morning," he began, and Amelia's stomach clenched. "I apologize for the invasion of privacy, but I had to understand. I had to know who you were." He looked down at his hands for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "My mother," he said, his voice quiet. "She passed away when I was in college. She was sick for years. A long, degenerative neurological condition. She saw dozens of specialists, the best doctors money could buy. They ran every test imaginable, but they could never give her a definitive diagnosis. They treated her symptoms, but they never found the cause. She wasted away in front of my eyes. That experience, it taught me that wealth can't fix everything, and it left me with a deep, abiding skepticism for experts who can't see the forest for the trees." He looked up, his eyes locking with hers. "Last night, you weren't an expert. You weren't a doctor. But you saw what was right in front of you. You trusted your knowledge and your instincts. You cut through the noise. I haven't seen that kind of clarity in a very, very long time." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. "I told you I could never repay you, but I have to try. I want to clear your family's debt. All of it. And I want to fund your return to medical school, full tuition, living expenses, whatever you need to finish what you started." Amelia stared at him, speechless. The offer was staggering, a fantasy she had never dared to entertain. It was a key, a way out of the loop, a chance to reclaim the life she had lost. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, her voice a whisper. "Why would you do all this for me?" "Because of what I said," he replied. "But there's another reason. The police have confirmed your diagnosis. It was a potent, fast-acting organophosphate, likely sprayed onto Arthur's food in the kitchen. This wasn't a random act. It was a targeted attack." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Arthur has been my COO for 20 years, but he announced his retirement last month. The dinner last night was meant to be his last major negotiation. Everyone in our world knew it. which means the poison wasn't meant for him. The blood drained from Amelia's face as the implication hit her. It was meant for you. Yes, Julian said, his expression grim. Thorne, or someone else, wanted me dead or incapacitated before the deal was finalized. And you, Amelia, are now the primary witness. You're the one who identified the poison. You're the one who can link it directly to that room, that plate of food. That makes you a target. He let that sink in before continuing. The money, the tuition, it's not just a thank you. It's also a way for me to keep you safe. I want you off the grid, out of that diner, out of your apartment. I have a security team ready. They'll find you a new place, provide protection until this is over. Amelia's head was spinning. A few days ago, her biggest worry was making rent. Now, she was a target in a corporate assassination plot. But I can't just disappear, she protested. My life, my friends. Your life is in danger, he countered, his tone hardening. Marcus Thorne is a ruthless man. If he's behind this, he will not hesitate to silence you, permanently. He stood and paced in front of the window. I need your help, Amelia. The police are investigating, but they're outsiders. You were there. You're observant. You might have seen something, anything, that could help us figure out how this happened. He stopped and turned to her, his expression a mixture of desperation and resolve. Work with me. Let me protect you, and in return, help me find the person who tried to murder me and nearly killed my best friend. Your insight could be invaluable. She looked at the man before her, a man whose world was so far removed from her own, it might as well have been another planet. He was offering her a way out of her old life, but the price was stepping deeper into his dangerous new one. She thought of Arthur Pennington, his kind smile, his life hanging in the balance. She thought of the cold reptilian eyes of Marcus Thorne, and she thought of the anatomy textbook hidden under her counter, a symbol of a dream she had been forced to abandon. Julian Davenport was offering her a chance to be more than just a waitress. He was offering her a chance to use the knowledge she had fought so hard to acquire, a chance to fight back. Okay, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll help you. A wave of relief washed over Julian's face. Thank you. He picked up a phone on his desk. Helen, we're moving forward. Initiate the protocol and clear my schedule for the foreseeable future. Ms. Torres will be my only priority. As he spoke, Amelia realized the $100 bill he'd left in the diner wasn't a retainer. It was a down payment. He hadn't just hired a waitress for the night. He had, unwittingly, hired an ally, and their war with Marcus Thorne had just begun. The following weeks were a dizzying plunge into a world Amelia could scarcely have imagined. She was moved into a luxury serviced apartment in a secure, anonymous building in Midtown, the kind with a 24-hour doorman and elevators that required a key card. A quiet, professional woman from Julian's security detail was assigned to her, a constant, unobtrusive shadow. Her old life was packed up and put into storage. Martha, her boss from the diner, was told Amelia had a family emergency and would be gone for a while. Julian had not just paid her lost wages. He'd sent an anonymous donation to the diner that was enough to fix the faulty walk-in freezer and replace the sputtering grill. It was his way of tidying up loose ends, of erasing Amelia's tracks. But Amelia was not a loose end. She quickly became the center of Julian's private investigation. They spent hours in the study of his brownstone, which she learned was his private residence, a refuge from the sterile glass penthouse he kept for business. With a large whiteboard and a stack of files, they mapped out the events of that night. Amelia's recall was photographic. She recounted every detail, The way Thorne had palmed his phone beneath the table, the waiter from the main floor who had brought in the plates, the brief moment the kitchen doors had swung open. Julian, in turn, provided the context, the intricacies of the deal, the pressure points, the motives. He was a brilliant strategist, but his thinking was linear, corporate. Amelia's was observational, human. They complemented each other in a way that was both unexpected and incredibly effective. "The waiter," she said one afternoon, pointing to a name on the board. His name was Leo. He seemed nervous, more so than the rest of the staff. The police interviewed him. He said he was just intimidated by the high-profile nature of the dinner, Julian countered, pacing the room. "No, it was more than that," Amelia insisted. His hands were shaking when he set down the plates, and he avoided looking at Thorne, not at you or Arthur, specifically at Thorne. Julian stopped pacing. "My team can look into him, see if there are any connections, any unexplained financial transactions." Their conversations often drifted beyond the investigation. He asked about medical school, about the subject she had loved, the future she had planned. She spoke of it with a wistful passion that he found captivating. In turn, she coaxed stories out of him about Arthur, about the early days of building his company from the ground up. She discovered a man beneath the armor of the CEO, a man who was fiercely loyal, burdened by responsibility, and profoundly lonely. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of poring over financial records, he ordered in food from a small, unassuming Italian place in the village. They ate not at the formal dining table, but sitting on the floor of the study, surrounded by their chaotic web of notes and theories. "Why do you keep this place?" she asked, gesturing around the book-lined room. "It's so different from the image you project." He was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "It was my father's," he said finally. "He was a history professor, not a businessman. He believed in books and ideas, not balance sheets." He smiled, a sad, distant expression. "He would have hated what I've become." "I don't think so," Amelia said softly. "I think he'd be proud of the way you care about people, the way you care about Arthur." His stormy eyes met hers across the scattered papers. The air in the room shifted, the space between them suddenly charged with an energy that had nothing to do with the investigation. He had seen her competence, her intelligence, her courage. But now he was seeing her, and she was seeing the vulnerable man behind the billion-dollar fortune. "Amelia," he began, his voice husky. Before he could continue, his phone rang, a shrill interruption. It was the head of his security team. Julian's expression hardened as he listened. "What is it?" Amelia asked as soon as he hung up. "Marcus Thorne knows where you are," he said, his voice grim. "Not this apartment, but he knows I've moved you. He's launched a counter-offensive." He handed her a tablet. It was open to a notorious gossip website. The headline was splashy and cruel. "Billionaire's near-death experience, staged by scheming waitress girlfriend." The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It painted Amelia as a conniving gold digger who had dropped out of college under a cloud of academic dishonesty, a complete fabrication, and had been stalking Julian for months. It suggested she had somehow orchestrated the food poisoning incident to play the hero and sink her claws into his fortune. Anonymous sources, friends of Thorne, no doubt, were quoted extensively. Amelia felt the blood drain from her face. "They're making it all up." "Of course they are," Julian said, his voice tight with fury. "This is how Thorne operates. He doesn't just attack you in the boardroom. He tries to destroy your reputation, to isolate you, to make you toxic." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pained regret. "I'm sorry, Amelia. I dragged you into this. I never should have. Don't, she said, cutting him off. Her initial shock was already hardening into a cold, steely resolve. He's doing this because he's scared. We're getting close, and he knows it. He thinks this will make me run. She met his gaze, her own eyes flashing. He's wrong. A slow, admiring smile spread across Julian's face. He has no idea who he's dealing with, does he? No, Amelia said. He doesn't. The attack, meant to drive them apart, had the opposite effect. It forged their partnership into something stronger, an alliance against a common enemy. The pretense of a purely professional relationship began to crumble, eroded by late nights, shared meals, and the undeniable current of attraction that flowed between them. The breakthrough came a few days later, from the deep dive into the waiter, Leo's financials. Julian's team found a single, large cash deposit into his sister's bank account 2 days after the poisoning. It was from a shell corporation that, after peeling back 3 layers of obfuscation, led directly to a holding company owned by Marcus Thorne. "It's the smoking gun," Julian said, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "We give this to the police, and they can pressure Leo to flip on Thorne." "It's not enough," Amelia said, shaking her head. "Thorne will have an explanation. A loan, a gift. He'll disavow Leo, say he was a disgruntled employee. We need something that ties Thorne directly to the poison itself." She stood and walked to the whiteboard, staring at the timeline of events. Her mind went back to the private dining room, replaying every second. "There was something else," she murmured, thinking aloud. "Something about Thorne, a detail I can't quite grasp." She closed her eyes, picturing him at the table. His slick smile, his expensive watch, the way he gestured with his hands as he spoke. He had a habit of tapping his pen on the table, a sleek, silver fountain pen. At one point, he'd unscrewed the cap to sign a preliminary document. She remembered a flicker of annoyance on his face, a dark smudge of ink on his thumb. He'd wiped it on his napkin discreetly. An ink leak. A trivial, meaningless detail. Or was it? "The poison," she said slowly, her eyes snapping open. "The lab report said it was suspended in a carrier oil, something that would allow it to be applied to the food without being immediately obvious." "Yes, a dimethyl sulfoxide base," Julian confirmed. "It helps the toxin absorb more rapidly." "What if it wasn't sprayed in the kitchen?" Amelia mused, her heart beginning to beat faster. "The kitchen staff were all cleared. The security is tight. What if it was applied right there, in the room?" "But how? We were all watching." "The pen," Amelia said, the idea taking shape with electrifying clarity. "His fountain pen. It leaked. He had ink on his hand." Julian stared at her. "Amelia, that's a huge leap. A leaking pen doesn't mean—" "A fountain pen has a reservoir, a cartridge," she pressed on, her voice gaining excitement. "What if it wasn't filled with ink? What if it was filled with the poison, suspended in that DMSO base? It would look like ink, a small, controlled leak onto the spinach as the plate was being served. It would be almost impossible to notice." It was an audacious theory, built on the flimsiest of observations, but it was the kind of elegant, arrogant, high-risk maneuver that fit the profile of a man like Marcus Thorne. "How do we prove it?" Julian asked, his skepticism now tinged with intrigue. "We make him show us," Amelia said, a plan forming in her mind. "We need to get him in a room again. With that pen." The trap was set with meticulous care. Julian, through his lawyers, called for an emergency arbitration meeting with Thorne, citing a newly discovered material breach in the acquisition proposal. The meeting was to be held in the main conference room of Davenport Industries, neutral ground, but with Julian's security and control, The pretext was flimsy, designed to be just plausible enough to get Thorne in the room without arousing too much suspicion. They banked on his arrogance, his belief that he had Julian on the ropes. Amelia's role was critical. She would be present, not as an accuser, but as Julian's special consultant. Her presence was the bait. Thorne, believing his smear campaign had worked, would see her. The conference room felt like a pressurized capsule, suspended 50 stories above the city. The world outside a silent, indifferent panorama of glass and steel. Inside, the air was thick with the unsaid, a toxic cocktail of legal posturing and simmering animosity. Amelia sat slightly behind Julian, her posture a study in practiced stillness. Her hands, resting on a leather-bound notepad, were steady, a stark contrast to the frantic, hummingbird beat of her heart. She was no longer a waitress. In this room, she was a weapon, carefully calibrated and aimed. Marcus Thorne entered with the breezy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He was a predator who had crippled his rival's most trusted advisor and then systematically dismantled his reputation. His gaze slid over Amelia, a flicker of contemptuous amusement in his eyes. He saw the centerpiece of his smear campaign, the scheming waitress, Julian's fatal flaw. He did not see the architect of his own imminent destruction. "Julian," Thorne began, his voice oozing a theatrical cordiality as he settled into his chair. "A bit of last-minute histrionics? I thought we were past this." Amelia's eyes were locked on the single, critical detail. A sleek silver fountain pen, its clip gleaming against the dark wool of his suit jacket. It was there, the linchpin of her audacious, terrifying theory. The meeting droned on, a ballet of objections and counter-arguments. Amelia took shallow, controlled breaths, anchoring herself in the present moment. She felt Julian's presence beside her, a solid wall of focused energy. They hadn't spoken much in the car on the way over. There was nothing left to say. They had rehearsed every possibility, every contingency, but it all came down to this. To a pen. To the arrogance of one man. Finally, Julian slid a single, crisp document across the vast expanse of polished mahogany. "Our final position. This addresses the alleged breach with a new liability clause. Sign it, Marcus, and your hostile takeover can proceed." A slow, triumphant smile spread across Thorne's face. He saw surrender. He picked up the document, his perusal a mere formality. "Desperate, Julian, but I'll grant you, it's a dignified way to fold." He reached into his jacket, his movements leisurely, savoring the moment. He produced the fountain pen. "Let's put your company out of its misery, shall we?" As his fingers twisted the cap, Julian's voice cut through the room, deceptively mild. "I've been thinking a great deal about that night, Marcus." Thorne paused, the pen's nib hovering an inch from the signature line. "Oh?" "About details," Julian continued, his stormy eyes never leaving the pen in Thorne's hand. "The forensics came back on the poison. A custom organophosphate, suspended in a dimethyl sulfoxide base. Nasty stuff. The DMSO makes it incredibly efficient, allows it to absorb directly through the skin, you see. You wouldn't even need to ingest it. A few drops, a simple touch. That would be enough." The smile on Thorne's face became a rigid, brittle thing. "A fascinating lesson in chemistry. I fail to see its relevance." "Its relevance," Julian said, his voice dropping, becoming as cold and hard as the glass walls around them, "is that it would be the perfect substance to carry into a secure room. You wouldn't need a vial or a spray bottle, just a small, self-contained reservoir. Something elegant, discreet. Something that, if it happened to spill a drop or two, might be mistaken for leaking ink." The air crackled. Thorne's lawyers shifted uneasily. sensing the shift from corporate negotiation to something far more dangerous. Thorne's knuckles, wrapped around the pen, were white. This was her cue. Amelia rose from her chair with a fluid, deliberate grace. All eyes swiveled to her. She walked not to the beverage station, but directly to the head of the table where a crystal carafe of water and a single glass had been placed. Her movements were calm, precise, devoid of the feigned clumsiness they had discussed. This was not a panicked accident. This was an execution. "What is this farce?" Thorne snapped, his composure finally fracturing. "Ms. Torres, my consultant," Julian said, his gaze still locked on Thorne, "has a hypothesis she wishes to test." Amelia picked up the heavy carafe. She walked around the table until she stood directly beside Marcus Thorne. He flinched as she approached, a subtle instinctual recoil. She held his gaze, her own expression unreadable, a placid mask of neutrality she had perfected over years of serving belligerent customers. Then, with a steady hand, she tilted the carafe. A stream of clear, cold water poured directly onto the document, onto Thorne's hand, onto the gleaming silver pen. It wasn't a splash. It was a deluge. Thorne let out a choked cry of outrage, snatching his hand back as if he'd been burned, but the damage was done. On the back of his hand, amidst the spreading water, were 3 distinct, dark droplets, clinging to his skin with an oily, hydrophobic tenacity. They were not diluting. They were not washing away. They were beginning to sheen, to spread, to sink into his pores. A terror so pure and absolute it seemed to suck the very air from the room bloomed on Marcus Thorne's face. He stared at his hand, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His mind, the source of his power and cruelty, had instantly betrayed him, leaping to the only possible conclusion. As Julian mentioned, DMSO is water-soluble, Amelia said, her voice cutting through his rising panic. It was not the voice of a waitress. It was the voice of a clinician delivering a terminal diagnosis. It would have washed away instantly. But that looks like an oil-based suspension. Hydrophobic. Much like the substance the lab found on the spinach served to Arthur Pennington. She took a step back, her work done. She met his terrified, wild eyes. And like that substance, it's absorbing directly into your bloodstream as we speak. I've read the toxicology reports. The initial symptoms are quite distinct. A tightness in the chest, profuse sweating, perhaps some involuntary muscle twitching. How are you feeling, Mr. Thorne? You're insane, he stammered, his gaze darting from his hand to her face, to Julian's. He was looking for a crack in their story, a sign of a bluff, but he found none. He found only the cold, hard certainty of his own doom. Whether the pen still held a lethal dose was, in that moment, utterly irrelevant. He had been poisoned by his own paranoia. His body was already reacting to the ghost of the toxin, his mind creating the symptoms he so richly deserved. A fine sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. "Am I?" Julian's voice was a whisper of finality. He touched a nearly invisible button on the console in front of him. "Detectives, if you would." The soundproofed doors at the far end of the conference room swung open. 2 grim-faced detectives entered, their presence transforming the corporate boardroom into a crime scene. One held up a warrant. The other carried a sealed biohazard evidence kit. "Marcus Thorne," the lead detective stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "We have a warrant to seize as evidence the fountain pen in your possession and to take you into custody for questioning regarding the attempted murder of Arthur Pennington and conspiracy to commit murder." Thorne did not seem to hear him. He was still staring at the dark, oily beads on his skin, his hand beginning to tremble. He looked up, his face a slack mask of utter ruin, his charming smile a forgotten relic. He had built an empire on his ability to see and exploit the weaknesses of others, but he had never once looked at the waitress from Queens and seen anything other than an object, a pawn, and in that fatal, arrogant blindness, he had sealed his own fate. The silence that descended upon the conference room after Thorne and his entourage were escorted out was heavier than any sound. It was a vacuum, filled with the ghosts of what had just transpired. The spilled water was already being soaked up by the pristine document, the ink of the signature line bleeding into a meaningless blur. Outside, the city continued its relentless, indifferent hum. Julian stood slowly, walking to the vast window and looking down at the river of yellow cabs flowing far below. He didn't speak for a long time. The adrenaline of the confrontation had evaporated, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Amelia remained by the table, her hands resting on the back of a chair. Her own adrenaline was fading, replaced by a tremor she could no longer suppress. She had done it. She had stared into the face of a man who would have killed her without a second thought, and had not flinched. The strength she had found within herself was terrifying. "He thought you were my weakness," Julian said finally, his voice raspy. He turned from the window, his eyes finding hers. The usual storm in their depths was gone, replaced by a raw, unsettling clarity. "He thought you were the girl from the diner, a vulnerability he could exploit." He took a step towards her. "He was wrong. You were never my weakness, Amelia. You were my conscience, my clarity. You were the one thing he could never account for." He stopped in front of her, the vast table no longer separating them. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, before gently touching her arm, as if to assure himself she was real. "Thank you," he whispered, and the words were freighted with more than just gratitude for saving his company or his friend. It was the gratitude of a man who had been pulled back from a precipice of his own making, a world of cold transactions and calculated cruelties. "We did it together," she said, her voice quiet. The tremor was subsiding, replaced by a strange sense of dislocation. Who was she now? Not the diner waitress, certainly, but not this cold, calculating strategist either. She felt like a stranger in her own skin. "No," he insisted softly. "I set the stage. You wrote the final act." He looked around the opulent room, a symbol of the world he inhabited, and a faint look of distaste crossed his features. "Let's get out of here." They left the building not through the grand lobby, but through a private exit, slipping into the back of his waiting car. As they pulled into the chaos of Manhattan traffic, Amelia looked at her reflection in the tinted window. She saw a woman in a simple, elegant dress, a woman who had just orchestrated the downfall of a billionaire. She felt an overwhelming urge to be back in her diner uniform, the familiar scent of coffee and grease a comforting anchor to a life that no longer existed. That life had been a cage, but it had been a familiar one. This new world was a terrifying, boundless freedom. The weeks that followed were a disorienting blend of legal proceedings and quiet introspection. Thorne, faced with the irrefutable forensic evidence from the pen and the full confession of the waiter, accepted a plea bargain that would see him spend the rest of his effective life in prison. His empire was dismantled, its assets carved up and sold off. The news cycle feasted on the scandal for a month, then moved on. Amelia found herself in a strange limbo. Julian had, as promised, erased her family's debt and established the scholarship in his mother's name. Her acceptance to Columbia was a tangible, heavy reality in her hands. Yet she felt adrift. The single-minded focus of the investigation had been a shield, protecting her from having to confront the seismic shifts in her own life. Now, the shield was gone. She visited Arthur Pennington at his home in the suburbs. He was thinner, frailer, but his eyes held the same warmth she remembered. They sat on his sun-drenched porch, drinking iced tea. "He's a different man, you know," Arthur said, swirling the ice in his glass. "Julian. I've known him since he was a boy who preferred building model rockets to reading stock reports. He built that company to protect himself, to build walls so high no one could ever hurt him, the way his mother's illness did. But the walls became a prison." He looked at her, his gaze kind and perceptive. "You didn't just save my life, my dear. You gave him his back." "I don't know what I did," Amelia confessed. "I just saw the details. That's all life is, isn't it?" Arthur smiled, seeing the details others miss. Their relationship with Julian settled into a new, undefined space. The constant proximity of the investigation was gone, and in its place was a chasm created by their vastly different lives. He was rebuilding a fractured division of his company. She was buying textbooks for organic chemistry. He would call her from his jet, flying back from Singapore, his voice crackling with static and exhaustion. She would be in the library until 2 a.m., surrounded by whispering students and the scent of old paper. The friction was inevitable. He tried to solve her problems the only way he knew how, with money. When her laptop crashed, a top-of-the-line replacement appeared at her door the next morning. When she mentioned struggling with a concept in physics, he offered to hire a Nobel laureate to tutor her. Each gesture, born of a genuine desire to care for her, felt like a subtle erosion of her own hard-won agency. "I have to do this myself, Julian," she told him one night, the frustration finally boiling over. They were in his brownstone, the one place that felt like neutral ground. "You can't just buy me a medical degree. I have to earn it. The struggle is the point. Don't you see that?" "I see you're exhausted," he countered, his own frustration evident. "I see you carrying a weight you no longer have to. Why won't you let me make it easier?" "Because my entire life has been hard," she retorted, her voice rising. "And for the first time, the hardship is a choice. It's my choice. It's for something I want. When you try to smooth the path, you're not helping me. You're taking that away from me. You're turning me back into a project, a problem to be solved." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and painful. He recoiled as if struck. She saw in his eyes not anger, but a deep, profound hurt. She saw the lonely boy building walls, trying to protect the one person he cared about, and failing. "That's not what you are," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You have never been a problem. You have always been the solution." The fight drained the anger from them, leaving them raw and vulnerable. They sat in silence for a long time, the chasm between the CEO and the student seeming impossibly wide. A year passed. A year of grueling study for Amelia, of relentless pressure for Julian. They found a fragile rhythm. He learned to stop offering solutions and started listening instead. He would show up at her small apartment near campus with takeout, and they would eat sitting on the floor, her textbooks spread around them like a fortress. She learned to see past the CEO, to understand the immense burden of responsibility he carried, and to offer him a sanctuary where he didn't have to be Julian Davenport, the titan of industry, but just Julian. One cool autumn evening, she was in the anatomy lab, late as usual. The scent of formaldehyde was no longer jarring. It was the scent of purpose. She was tracing the intricate path of the brachial plexus on a cadaver, her gloved fingers moving with a growing confidence. Her phone buzzed, and she ignored it. A few minutes later, it buzzed again. With a sigh, she pulled off her gloves and checked the message. It was from Julian. A single sentence. "Meet me at the diner. I think it's time we close the loop. The Morning Glory Diner. She hadn't been back in over a year. The thought sent a jolt of anxiety through her. An hour later, she pushed open the familiar glass door. The little bell chimed, the same sound that had announced his arrival into her life. The diner was empty, closed for the night. The lights were dimmed, but one booth was illuminated by a soft glow. Julian was sitting there, in the exact same spot where he had first sat. A single cup of black coffee was on the table in front of him. She slid into the vinyl seat opposite him. It felt surreal, like stepping into a memory. "What are we doing here, Julian?" she asked softly. He didn't answer immediately. He pushed a small velvet box across the table. It wasn't a ring box, it was flat, rectangular. Confused, she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a key. An old, ornate, brass key. "That's the key to the brownstone," he said. "My father gave it to my mother when he first bought the house. He told her it wasn't just a house, it was a library with a kitchen attached, and he couldn't imagine filling it with books or life without her." He looked at her, his stormy eyes stripped of all artifice, all power. They held only a quiet, desperate hope. "I'm not asking you to move in with me, Amelia. I'm not asking you to give up your apartment or your independence. I am asking you to consider that house our home, a place you can come to whenever you want, a place you belong. My world is loud and complicated, and often ugly. Yours is demanding, and requires a focus I can only admire. I don't want to fix your problems or smooth your path. I want to build a place where we can both find shelter from our respective storms." He gestured around the empty diner. "This is where our story started, with a transaction. I needed a waitress. You needed $500. It was simple." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I want to make a new transaction. My father's library has plenty of room for your medical textbooks. The study is quiet. In exchange, I just want you there. Not as a solution, or a consultant, or a conscience. Just as Amelia." She looked from the key in the box to his earnest, waiting face. This was not a grand gesture from a billionaire. This was a quiet, humble offering from a man who had learned the difference between possessing and partnering. He was not trying to absorb her into his world. He was asking to build a new one with her. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. They weren't tears of sadness or even overwhelming joy, but of a profound, soul-deep recognition. She had come full circle. The journey that began in this greasy spoon diner, a journey of poison and power, fear and courage, had led her right back here, to a simple choice. She closed the box, her fingers wrapping around its solid weight. She looked at the man across the table, the man she had saved, the man who had, in turn, set her free. "Okay, Julian," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Let's fill that library."